All right, here's what we're going to do now. This is the second half of the video, so pretty soon here in a moment I'm going to fast forward through a lot of slides, and we're going to get down to the last few questions here. But again, we want to make sure we do a thorough job in reviewing for this exam. So here's all the slides we covered in the first part. So we're just going to go through these kind of quickly and get to where we left off. All right, we left off with question number 6. We have to do the 3 progressive presidents. How did Theodore Roosevelt expand the powers of the federal government, and why did most people cheer such a shift in power? And one other quick thing to say, and I will always do this at the end of this video, I'll also talk a little bit about the long essay. And, you know, there's only so many questions I can ask for any particular unit, just because the time periods are pretty short. But we'll talk about that. So we want to look at how did Theodore Roosevelt expand the powers of the federal government, and why did most people cheer such a shift in power? And I want to emphasize this. Even our most popular presidents had people that didn't like them. You know, in modern times, the president, you know, Theodore Roosevelt is one of them. When he runs for re-election in 1904, he wins more than 60% of the public vote, of the popular vote. There's only been 3 presidents in the last 100+ years that have achieved that level of, you know, success. And what you have to keep in mind is, even for your most popular presidents, there were people that didn't like them. And it's never been 100%. It's never been 90 or 80 or 70% even. 6 out of 10 people liking your president is about as good as it gets in a capitalist democracy, putting our economy and politics together there. All right, so let's look at the things he did. And we've got a laundry list of 6 things that he did. And we want to spend just a quick second or two on, you know, who would love it and who would hate it. So he was a trust buster. So he busted 44 trusts in 7.5 years using the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, it was passed some 20 years earlier, give or take, but he's the first president to make use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he busts the first 44 trusts in the history of this country. There have been 0 trusts busted prior to him becoming president. And one thing for us to keep in mind as we talk about that is the first trust ever busted was Northern Securities, which was partially owned by Minnesotan James J. Hill, but also J.P. Morgan. I mean, he's going after the richest, most powerful person in America at his time and making him the first victim of what he's doing. He was a big game hunter, and he understood that if you took down the biggest, most powerful animal first, all the other animals know that, well, who am I then? So there's also a little bit of psychological warfare going on there. Then you, of course, had the 1902 coal miners' strike, where Roosevelt is getting involved on behalf of the strikers, and that had never been done by the government before. But remember, a coal strike, when winter's approaching, was a pretty big deal. It was also your railroad industry ran off of it, and all of your factories ran off of coal. You had the Hepburn Act and the ICC, and you could also put the Elkins Act with that as well. Now, the ICC, again, had been passed some 15, 20 years earlier, but no president had really ever passed any laws. The ICC said that the government could regulate things that cross state lines. Well, for the first time ever, that's being done. And what's important to remember as you talk about that, the first time ever that it had been done, is this idea that you were going to, I like to call it the McDonald's Acts. You had to put your prices out there. It had to be consistent for everybody. You couldn't play favorites. And you couldn't give politicians free rides or the opposition free rides, so to speak. If 2 people are shipping a ton of material from St. Paul to Chicago, they both pay the same freight. And that's what you want to make sure you do, and your prices are clearly marked. That's why I think of it as a McDonald's. Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. We're going to make sure that if you put something in your body, whether it's food or it's cough medicine, that it works and it's safe. and you have to prove that. And then you have the national parks system. Now, we'd had the Yellowstone National Park already created, but really Roosevelt's the one that gives you the modern national park system that we have today. The Devil's Tower was the first thing he added, but he'll add lots of other things like the Grand Canyon. So one quick thing to do here, and there's a lot in this one. Taft, the next one is going to be a little bit lighter, and then Wilson will be a lot. Sometimes Roosevelt is referred to as the square deal or the 3 C's. Consumer protection, Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act is an example of that. Conservation, national parks, 200 plus million acres is put aside. And control of corporations, trust busting, and the Elkins Act and Hepburn Act with the ICC. So some people refer to this as the 3 C's. Now, obviously, if you were a victim of food poisoning, you'll like this. If you were the victim of drugs that didn't do what they said or were dangerous, remember, heroin and cocaine were frequently used in drugs at this time, or drugs were just nothing, snake oil, so to speak. And you know, certainly if you owned businesses, you didn't much like this. And remember, Roosevelt is a Republican, and Republicans had traditionally been for smaller government, more laissez-faire-esque than anything else. Question number 7. How did Taft anger progressives? How did the actions taken by Taft make progressives happy? And why was it so hard to hold progressives and traditional Republicans together? I kind of held off on this because I knew we'd come to it here. And again, I made it into a nice little table here. In some ways, Taft has an impossible job. Roosevelt is a Republican, but he's talking about breaking down trusts who are owned by some of the biggest business people around who are also Republicans. He's talking about the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is being aimed at the meatpacking industry, especially around Chicago, and you know, anyone making food and drugs around the United States. Well, many of those were traditional Republicans. So we have a split growing in the Republican Party, that part of the Republican Party wants to regulate business, which is the other part of the Republican Party. And so there's starting to become some very deep cracks within the Republican base. And you're Taft. You've got these two warring factions, and you don't have 60% approval rating. There's going to be a problem. So in some ways, Taft is trying to make both sides happy. So he busts twice as many trusts in half the time. So if you liked Roosevelt busting trusts, you double liked Taft. How about that for a little George Orwellian speech? You liked him twice as much. If you didn't like the fact that Roosevelt had busted 44 trusts, you like this a lot less. You like Taft less. Now, Taft also wants to make big business happy. So he helps ultimately raise the tariff, which makes progressives mad and Republicans, traditional business Republicans, happy. Then he creates the Bureau of Mines, a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, the Bureau of Mines is like a police force for our national parks. So although Roosevelt set aside 200 million acres, some of the acres aren't necessarily being policed very well. Well, he's going to create a police force. Remember, we talked about this in class. It's one thing to pass a law. You have to enforce it. And many Republicans are kind of mad. But then he fires Guilford Pinchot and hires Richard Bollinger to be in charge of the national park system. And he is much more likely to allow, even with a police force, to allow businesses to use land that had previously been set aside by Roosevelt. So you really see someone here trying to make both sides of his party happy at the same time, and quite frankly, in the process, making neither of them very happy. That's going to be a problem. Our last question, how did Wilson expand the role of government far beyond Roosevelt, and how did his actions create an imprint that is still visible today? So here we have a list again. Now, let's go over this. Sometimes Wilson is called the triple wall of privilege. We have the 3 C's for Roosevelt, or the square deal. This is called the New Freedom, or the triple wall of privilege. trying to knock down the triple wall privilege and essentially create a level playing field, and that the rich aren't protected from not being rich, so to speak, and the poor people can never be rich because of this wall. That's the political argument. He creates the Federal Reserve Act, and which he spearheads that movement, and you get the Federal Reserve System. Again, passed by Congress, but he's the president, and he was advocating some of these changes. We still have it today. We control the supply of money through interest rates. Well, this is where interest rates come from as an organized group. You get the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act said you shouldn't have a monopoly if you're bad. If you're a good monopoly, you should be allowed to continue to exist. So really the reason Roosevelt busts 44 but Taft busts 90 is because they had different definitions of good and bad. The Clayton Antitrust Act essentially says all monopolies are bad, so you shouldn't have them. And then he creates the Federal Trade Commission as a police force. Again, we're back to a common theme. If you're going to make something illegal, if you're going to make it so people can't do things, you need a police force to make sure that doesn't happen. He creates income taxes with the 16th Amendment, but he also lowers the tariff. Now, I know right away, again, you're looking at through a modern lens, you're like, people wanted an income tax? Well, when the income taxes, you remember from your article in class, the first 1040, when income taxes were created, only the richest Americans paid it. A very small fraction of people did. The average American paid $0 in taxes. So it was, sure, it was popular to just make those people pay the tax as an income tax, and I don't have to pay a tariff. So it's a shift of tax burden from more of everyone under a tariff to a select group. Now, over time, after World War I, it won't just be the rich people who pay income taxes. Many Americans do. I want to shy away from most because that could be seen as politically divisive. And that's a matter of debate in our today's society. And then, so here's our triple wall. We've got, banks, we've got taxes, and we've got trusts that are being dealt with here by him. We then get three things that are kind of a sign of things to come. We will eventually get these for all workers, but here it's for only a select few. So federal workers get workman's compensation. Well, everybody has workman's comp now, but federal workers start off as the only ones with it. Essentially, Franklin Roosevelt, when he's president during the Great Depression, this will expand to everybody. A limited child labor. The Keating-Owens Act. Eventually, under Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, all child labor will be banned. And even today, if you're, for example, 15 years of age, I think you can have a job, but there's a lot of limits on how many hours you can work, at what time, what equipment you can use, what equipment you can't. That will all essentially come out later. And then the Adamson Act, the first 8-hour workday. Now, it was only for railroad workers, but eventually it will be for everyone. So, we've got three pretty big changes that we still have the Clayton Antitrust Act today. We still have income taxes today. We've lowered tariffs in recent decades to almost zero, and with Mexico and Canada, with NAFTA or the WTO, World Trade Organization, we still have, interest rates, and we now have workman's comp. Child labor has been largely taken out, and you have the 8-hour workday with paid overtime. Well, this is the end of, and again, these are the grading rubrics. This is what I will grade your short answers again. So for half the test, this is it. Now, again, it isn't enough to watch the video. Now, one last thing I want to emphasize. You have this long essay, multiple choice, you know what a multiple choice is. But this long argumentative essay. Let me speak to that a little bit right here. Realize I'm going to ask you an argumentative question from the progressive age. There's only so many things I can ask you to argue that would cover a vast majority of the information. I'm not going to ask you an argumentative essay about one thing. That's not fair, and I don't think that's an adequate measure of your learning. But I could ask you a question: which of the three presidents was the best progressive, using the definition of what progressives wanted? I could ask you a question about the reform movement versus the presidents. Did the reform movement, did the presidents collectively live up to what the reformers wanted them to do? So I could ask you that question and kind of play the A versus B, reformers versus the presidents collectively. I could break up the presidents into A, B, and C and say, hey, which one did the better job and why? There's only so many things I can do here if I'm asking you to argue all of it. Or I could ask you about the progressive movement as a whole. Did the progressive movement as a whole, which made government bigger, is that ultimately a good thing or a bad thing in American history? You make the call. Now, these argumentative essays, the long essay that I'll have you write as a part of each unit, you can't get a wrong answer from the sense of you can argue whatever you want to argue. Can you use some proper nouns to back up your argument as if you're a lawyer in the courtroom? Think of your typical court drama, Law and Order. I was trying to think of one. Law and Order, for example, and you're going to argue something is innocent or guilty. You would use evidence to prove that. So use your proper nouns as evidence. So you could use Clayton Antitrust Act or the Kern-McGillicuddy Act. I do love that name, McGillicuddy. And I put these in red to kind of bring this out in many places. These are all proper nouns that you could use to make that point. So again, go through here, use the information found here, and if you knew and were prepared for these questions, on the day of the test we only pick 3 of those questions. If you're ready for these questions, though, you would be ready for the long essay. It would be impossible for you not to be. So for that 2/3 of the test, you kind of know what's on it. It's really the multiple choice that I really can't help you with. The more you know the material, the better you should do on that. And I do norm the multiple choice part of the test. All right, that's it. This is Unit 1, and you're either watching this to review for the Unit 1 test or as part of getting ready for the retake. Good luck.